What happens to the human soul when a vow made in utter poverty, after decades, encounters the temptation of boundless wealth? Whose name do you see every morning, approaching the mirror in the bathroom, without even thinking about the massive human drama hidden behind these painfully familiar letters? And why has history virtually remained silent about the fact that the foundation of one of the world's most recognizable trading empires was built on a strict, almost fanatical spiritual contract, which was ultimately ruthlessly broken by its own heirs? Today we stand on the threshold of a forgotten architectural masterpiece. This colossal mansion, whose market value today is estimated at $7.5 million, huge darkened windows gaze at the overgrown park like empty eye sockets of a bygone era. Inside, precious plaster is slowly crumbling, and monumental fireplaces made of the rarest mahogany are covered with a thick layer of decades-old dust. This is not just an abandoned house of a rich family, of which there are many on the east coast of the United States of America. This is a physical, tangible embodiment of a broken promise. A monument to how colossal money can, over time, erode even the strongest moral foundations and turn a legacy of service into a legacy of selfishness. But to understand the true tragedy of this decline, we must go back 2 centuries. Our story began not at all in a palace, but in a cold, damp workshop smelling of soot and rancid animal fat on Dutch Street in New York. It was 1806. A young man named William Colgate stood by a huge, boiling cauldron. He was from Kent County in England, the son of a political refugee, a boy who too early learned what real, stomach-burning hunger and social isolation in a foreign country are like. His main defining trait was not a brilliant business acumen, as many modern analysts might think, but absolute, unwavering inner discipline, bordering on religious fervor. No one knew that this modest young man, selling cheap soap and tallow candles to tired workers in the port, at this very moment was laying the first stone in a corporation that would one day conquer the entire world. It seemed impossible that his surname would become a synonym for purity for billions of people on all continents. But it is here that the first historical paradox and the main turning point of our story lie. The man whom the press and biographers would later dub the King of Toothpaste actually never sold a single gram of this product throughout his entire long life. William Colgate never in his life saw the famous flavored paste in glass jars, which would appear on shelves only in 1873. He didn't even suspect the existence of the convenient lead tube, which would revolutionize the hygiene industry only in 1896, already under the management of his ambitious descendants. The entire life of the founder was devoted to grueling, dirty work as a soap boiler. He daily boiled caustic lye, wearing his hands bloody, while his lungs inhaled the heavy steam of New York winters. It was during this most difficult period, standing in the foul-smelling soapworks, that William made a decision that forever determined the fate of his dynasty. Realizing that hard labor was beginning to bring the first, albeit tiny, incomes, he remembered the advice of an old family friend given to him before leaving home. This advice became his personal, unbreakable manifesto. William made a solemn vow to give exactly 10% of every earned cent to charity and aid for the needy. For a young merchant barely making ends meet in the harsh, developing capitalist world of the 19th century, this seemed like pure financial suicide. Why give away 1/10 of his meager funds when he barely had enough to pay rent for the cramped premises and purchase basic raw materials? But William was unyielding. For him, this gesture was not an advertising gimmick or a hypocritical attempt to buy respect from high society. It was a strict, intimate contract with his own conscience. And as his soap factory grew, this contract would face increasingly severe tests. How exactly did poverty shape a philosophy capable of building a multi-million-dollar empire? And why did this same philosophy become a time bomb for his great-great-grandchildren? To understand the true nature of what we today call a huge corporation, it is necessary to look into the very essence of its creator's worldview. William Colgate's roots went back to the damp, restless soil of Kent County. He was born in 1783 in the family of farmer Robert Colgate, a man with a complex and dangerous character for those times. Robert openly sympathized with the American struggle for independence and the ideas of the French Revolution, which in conservative England at the end of the 18th century was considered a state crime.
Due to incessant political persecutions and the real threat of imprisonment, the family was forced to abandon all their modest property and flee across the ocean in 1798, finding temporary, shaky refuge on a farm near Baltimore. It was this harsh experience of sudden loss of everything that shaped in young William a completely paradoxical view of the world. While other immigrants saw in young America simply an unlimited chance for quick enrichment, Colgate learned a cruel lesson. Any material stability is illusory, and social status can be destroyed by the political system in an instant. He deeply understood that one could rely only on unbreakable internal principles and cold, iron calculation. Leaving his parental home because the ruined farm simply could not feed the large family, the 16-year-old youth set off to conquer New York. It was 1804. The huge city met him not with streets paved with gold, but with impassable mud, foul sewers, and the fiercest commercial competition, where everyone tried to survive at any cost. William got a job as a simple apprentice to a local soap boiler, and it was in this suffocating atmosphere of boiling animal fat that his first great strategy began to take shape. The New York market of the early 19th century was a complete, chaotic flea market. Old, inherited money confidently controlled prestigious cotton and tobacco trade, while the production of basic everyday goods was left to small dealers. Merchants shamelessly deceived buyers, selling rancid, quickly crumbling soap, whose weight was artificially increased by adding sand and cheap impurities. No one cared about reputation when working with the lower strata of society. But William Colgate possessed what New York merchants catastrophically lacked. He was a true dreamer, who at the same time thought in the precise categories of an engineer and architect. He clearly saw what others stubbornly ignored. Soap was no longer a luxury item for rich aristocrats. It was rapidly becoming a basic need for the huge, growing working class. His intellectual strategy consisted not in seeking blind, momentary luck, but in implementing strict, almost fanatical standardization. In 1806, he opened his own tiny business on Dutch Street. While short-sighted competitors tried to save a couple of cents on low-quality raw materials, William personally controlled every batch of his product. He weighed every piece on precise scales, guaranteeing absolute honesty of the stated weight. This was a classic, sharpest social conflict. An unknown, poor outsider challenged the established system of widespread deception, building unshakable trust in a city that had long ago stopped believing anyone. His ambitions were truly colossal, but they were always strictly restrained by cold, mathematical calculation. He never took risky loans he couldn't repay, and did not expand production just for the sake of scaling. And it is here that the true psychological explanation of that very contract with conscience lies, which became the unshakable foundation of his entire long life. Leaving home in his youth, he met an old, pious captain of a river barge who told him, "Someone will definitely become the leading soap boiler in New York, and it could be you if you honestly give a tenth of your earnings to the Creator." For pragmatic William, these words became not just a beautiful mystical prediction, but a powerful psychological anchor.
By giving exactly 10%, he artificially, consciously limited his own greed. Charity became his main tool of self-discipline, a reliable way not to go mad in the harsh world of pure, soulless capital. Colgate was a man woven from the deepest internal contradictions. On one hand, an incredibly modest Christian who personally delivered his goods to customers' homes, not at all ashamed of heavy manual labor. On the other, a ruthlessly demanding entrepreneur toward himself and others, who methodically drove out of the market everyone who did not meet his highest standards. When his numerous competitors went bankrupt en masse during the severe economic crises of 1819 and 1837, Colgate's company stood motionless, like a granite monolith. He created the first reliable citywide delivery system. He was the first to proudly stamp his own name on every piece of soap produced. His personal name became a true mark of quality, long before the very concept of a brand entered widespread commercial use. Every late evening, in the dim, flickering light of a tallow candle, William silently sat down at his heavy accounting ledgers. He recorded every earned cent of income and every cent of donations with manic, almost frightening precision. His incomes steadily grew, and with them, constantly grew the percentage he voluntarily gave away. 15, 20, and then an incredible 30% of net profit went to various social needs. He sincerely considered himself the absolute winner in the complex game with human vice, devoutly believing that he had found the perfect formula in which growing wealth does not corrupt the soul at all. But, bending over his perfect columns of figures, this genius strategist did not even suspect the most terrible historical paradox. He categorically did not understand that, by turning living morality into a strict mathematical percentage, he left his distant heirs not a burning spiritual compass, but merely a dry financial formula. How exactly did the smoke-scented soapworks transform into impenetrable corporate armor? And what strategic alliance of worlds forever changed the status of this once modest family in high society? In 1857, the unyielding William Colgate passed away, leaving behind a colossal fortune and that very iron moral contract that required giving a huge share of profits to charity. It seemed that his heirs would simply continue methodically boiling soap in dirty cauldrons, multiplying capital away from New York's social salons. But history decided otherwise, and it was at this moment that a man whose decisions forever changed the social code of this dynasty stepped onto the stage. The second key character in our drama was the founder's son, Samuel Colgate. Unlike his stern father, Samuel no longer knew the taste of real hunger, but he experienced a completely different, no less tormenting kind of discomfort. Social. In the developing American society of the mid-19th century, huge money earned from producing cheap animal fat and laundry powder for the poor had a distinct, indelible smell of the common folk. The Colgates were fabulously rich, but the old American aristocracy still looked at them as lucky manual laborers. To break this invisible wall, a radical strategic step was required, and in 1851, a turning point occurred that can confidently be called the perfect clash of two absolutely different universes. Samuel Colgate married Susan Farnham Colby. This was not just a union of two people in love, it was a brilliant, calculated integration of industrial millions into the highest echelon of the political elite. Susan was the daughter of the current governor of New Hampshire, Anthony Colby. She grew up in an atmosphere of refined political receptions, intellectual conversations, and impeccable manners. In her person, the rough commercial grip of the soapmakers united with the refined influence of old state power. This union became the most powerful catalyst. The young wife categorically did not want to be associated with the smell of lye and port warehouses.
It was her refined taste and high society ambitions that forced Samuel to completely reconsider the development vector of the family empire. Under her invisible but firm guidance, the company makes an astonishing turnaround. In 1872, a fundamentally new product appears on the market that forever erases the stigma of a cheap soapworks: perfumed toilet soap, whose scent instantly captivated pampered ladies from high society. And just a year later, in 1873, the Colgates, for the first time in history, release flavored toothpaste in elegant glass jars. This was no longer just business. It was trade in pure luxury and aesthetics. The family's social position soared to the heavens. Yesterday's producers of tallow candles now dictated standards of beauty and hygiene for the richest homes in the United States of America. And it was this triumphant transition from utility to exclusivity that required the creation of a completely new material symbol of their greatness. Modest brick houses in business districts no longer suited them. They needed a real palace that would drown out any memories of the poor immigrant grandfather. Thus begins the monumental history of creating grand country residences whose pinnacle will be that very object whose value today exceeds $7.5 million. The purchase of gigantic land plots in the most prestigious and closed areas became the first step toward physically securing the new status. Observing the first stages of designing these colossal estates, contemporaries were amazed by the scale. It was no longer just housing. It was an architectural manifesto designed to prove to the entire world the absolute superiority of the dynasty. The construction was conceived as a complex symbiosis. Heavy, age-old traditions of European monarchs were to organically merge with advanced American comfort technologies. The classical met the innovative on every square foot. Just imagine this contrast. Where the grandfather stood knee-deep in dirty water, his grandsons erected walls that were to stand for millennia. The first sketches and foundations of future mansions were laid, with unprecedented meticulousness. Huge, light-flooded spaces were designed to overwhelm any guest from the threshold with the scale of the host's influence. Only the best imported stone was selected for construction, and the most expensive architects of the Gilded Age were brought in to work. The intent was for every marble block brought from across the ocean, every hand-carved oak ornament, to scream that this family did not just earn their money, but had a divine, indisputable right to rule this world. But it was precisely at this moment of triumphant merging of worlds that a hidden psychological crack was laid in the foundation of future greatness. Samuel, raised in religious strictness, continued to faithfully donate millions of dollars to universities and churches, devoutly honoring his father's vow. However, the form of this money had radically changed. If, for William, charity was a painful tearing away from himself of the last piece of bread, then for his heirs, giving away even 30% of profits was completely unnoticeable against the backdrop of the remaining astronomical sums, which now amounted to tens of millions. They were buying themselves indulgences for boundless luxury. How exactly did this colossal architectural project become the most precise psychological mirror of its creators? And why would the ideal, shining corridors of the new palace soon turn into a golden cage for subsequent generations? To truly understand the psychology of the dynasty at the peak of its power, it is not enough to just look at bank accounts. One needs to physically enter that very house, which became the pinnacle of their architectural ambitions. Today, this monumental complex, sprawling on closed territory, is valued at a staggering $7.5 million. This is not just a figure in a real estate catalog. It is the equivalent of thousands of years of labor of an ordinary American worker from the early 20th century.
And every detail of this colossal structure was designed not for comfort, but as a tool of psychological pressure on the surrounding world. The first impression upon approaching the mansion was created through the harshest contrast. Huge wrought iron gates and a long driveway intentionally prolonged the journey time, making the guest feel small and insignificant, even before crossing the threshold. When the heavy oak doors opened, the visitor entered the grand hall, whose height exceeded any expectations. Here reigned not warm coziness, but icy grandeur. A floor of the rarest imported marble, brought by ships from Europe, and colossal mirrors that made daylight dance endlessly across the walls, creating an illusion of infinite space. This was the first psychological layer, a demonstration of absolute, overwhelming power. But the architecture of this house worked on the principle of progressive revelation. The transition from the grand hall to the library was a transition from ostentatious wealth to an imitation of deep intellectuality. The library, paneled in dark walnut wood, smelled of centuries and old books, most of which were bought in entire collections from England and never read by the owners. In the center of the room was a colossal fireplace, in which a whole tree could be burned. This fire symbolized not warmth, but the family's ability to destroy resources simply to create the desired atmosphere. The room was a visual deception, an attempt to buy centuries-old history for a family that just a few decades ago had nothing. The contrast between public and private zones was striking. If the grand reception rooms shone with crystal chandeliers and gold stucco, the private bedrooms of the heirs on the upper floors were surprisingly cold and austere. Here, away from prying eyes, luxury gave way to some oppressive emptiness. The house had more than 40 rooms, and this number itself was a numerical anchor of ambitions. Why did a family of just a few people need 40 rooms? The answer lies in isolation. The space was organized so that family members could go days without crossing paths with each other, each inhabiting their own perfect world. Special attention is drawn to the complex, hidden from view system of movement for the servants. A whole army of service staff worked in the house, but the architects created a labyrinth of narrow corridors, secret doors, and hidden staircases. Servants were supposed to appear like ghosts, silently changing towels, lighting fireplaces, and disappearing without catching the owner's eyes. This architectural element perfectly reflected the Colgate's new philosophy. They no longer wanted to see heavy labor. What their grandfather considered a blessing and the meaning of life, daily, dirty work with their own hands, was now hidden behind thick panels of mahogany. In the dining room, where politicians, magnates, and owners of old money gathered around the long table, the walls literally whispered stories of grand mergers and acquisitions. It was in such rooms that decisions were made, affecting the economy of the entire country. But amid this splendor, amid the silver tableware and crystal glasses, the spirit of William Colgate had completely dissolved. His sacred vow of donations turned from a spiritual act into a routine line in an accounting report signed by hired managers. Money still flowed to universities and churches, but it no longer contained living human sacrifice. The psychological portrait that this house paints is a portrait of deep inner insecurity, hidden behind thick walls. The creators of this mansion tried to prove to the whole world that they were not just sellers of toothpaste in lead tubes, but true rulers of America. They surrounded themselves with antiques, hired the best masters of the era, erected a monument to their success. But strolling today through these abandoned, echoing corridors, mentally moving from one crumbling room to another, it is impossible not to wonder, what was happening in the souls of the people who lived in this golden sarcophagus? What human tragedy made this perfect picture crack at the seams? And how exactly did colossal wealth begin to destroy the dynasty from within? Amid the monumental grandeur of 40 rooms, behind heavy velvet curtains and perfect facades of expensive stone, a quiet but destructive human tragedy began to unfold. If the first generations of Colgates struggled with external poverty and fierce market competition, then the heirs of the early 20th century faced a far more insidious enemy: inner emptiness and moral paralysis. The enormous wealth, which should have become a tool of boundless opportunities, turned into an invisible straitjacket. The main conflict unfolded within those who were born into absolute, unlimited luxury. Imagine the psychology of the heir who from the first breath knows that he will never in his life have to work for survival. He has no goal comparable in scale to founding a global empire. He is deprived of that very animal thirst for life that forced old William to stand for 18 hours by a boiling cauldron of lye. This ambivalence became the core of the moral crisis. How to find the meaning of existence when every desire of yours is fulfilled, even before you have time to realize it. At this moment, the third key character in our story steps onto the stage, a typical representative of the late generation of the dynasty. This heir was superbly educated at the best universities, which his own ancestors had once generously funded. He was knowledgeable in European art, wore impeccable suits, and knew how to conduct social conversations. But behind this polished exterior hid a deep existential horror. He found himself trapped between two worlds. On one side, the gigantic, oppressive legacy of the great ancestor weighed on him. The holy vow, the obligation to give huge sums to charity, and the need to match the ideal image of the American dream. On the other side, he realized that all this charity had long turned into a hypocritical, soulless mechanism for tax avoidance and buying public influence. The contrast between the declared family values and real life was striking. The family continued to donate millions of dollars to build churches and support missionaries, but at the same time, their own business methods became increasingly aggressive and cynical, swallowing small competitors and monopolizing the market. The heir saw this falseness every day. He saw how the founder's vow, originally conceived as an act of deepest humility before God, transformed into a sophisticated PR tool. This contradiction between the external grandeur of benefactors and inner spiritual emptiness slowly destroyed his psyche. The catalyst for the transformation was a woman, his wife, who belonged to a completely different, pragmatic world of new money in the 20th century. Unlike Susan Farnham Colby, who at one time integrated the family into the aristocracy, this woman brought into the house the spirit of absolute, cold consumerism. She did not understand why give tens of millions to some abstract social projects when those funds could be spent on buying new estates in Europe, exclusive yachts, and diamonds. Her intervention became the turning point. She began methodically, day by day, to question the expediency of William's sacred vow. She posed simple but poisonous questions. Why should we give away our rightful money? Why should we live by the rules of a man who died almost a century ago? Her logic was impeccable in its cynicism, and the heir, long tired of the weight of others' expectations, succumbed to this influence. He made a decision that forever changed the course of the family's history. Gradually, without loud announcements, the percentage of charitable deductions began to decrease. The perfectly calibrated system that had worked for decades failed. Funding for social projects was cut, and the freed-up, gigantic sums were directed toward sustaining an increasingly extravagant lifestyle. But was this heir an anti-hero? Can one condemn a person for simply wanting to live his own life, rather than being an eternal slave to his great-grandfather's manic idea? Isn't the desire to free oneself from the burden of the past logical? Herein lies the deepest moral layer of the story. Rejecting the vow seemed like an act of liberation, shedding of shackles. But in reality, it was the destruction of the only foundation that held this dynasty back from complete moral decay. By severing the invisible connection to their roots, the family found itself one-on-one with the ruthless machine of consumption. And this rupture inevitably led to catastrophe. How exactly did the external world and inner demons provoke the massive crisis that brought down the walls of their perfect palace? No artificially created illusion of absolute control can last forever. The crisis that befell the dynasty was not just a random confluence of circumstances, but an inevitable mathematical consequence of their own decisions. Rejecting the founder's vow, cutting social investments, and plunging into endless, unrestrained consumption made them vulnerable in the face of global historical upheavals. The catastrophe did not come in the form of sudden bankruptcy of the huge corporation. The factories continued to churn out millions of toothpaste tubes every day, generating fantastic revenues. The tragedy was much deeper. It lay in the total disintegration of the family itself and the physical destruction of their monumental legacy. The early 20th century brought with it the Great Depression, a cardinal change in tax legislation in the United States of America, and 2 world wars. The new economic reality made maintaining colossal mansions, like the one valued today at $7.5 million, practically impossible, even for the richest people on the planet. Luxury taxes skyrocketed. The army of servants that once invisibly moved through the maze-like corridors, demanding huge salaries, gradually dispersed. The monumental house with 40 rooms, once symbolizing absolute power, turned into a gigantic, voracious black hole, sucking resources. This was the most powerful external conflict, but the real blow was dealt by the internal conflict. The generation of heirs who severed the connection with their great-grandfather's spiritual foundation proved completely unprepared for difficulties. Without a unifying idea, without that very contract with conscience that disciplined previous generations, the family began to disintegrate into isolated, warring factions. Divorces, lawsuits for shares in the corporation, scandals in the yellow press. All this became the norm for people whose surnames stood every morning on the sink of millions of decent citizens. It was in this atmosphere of chaos and decline that the key moment of transformation occurred for one of the heirs. Finding himself in the empty, cooling mansion, where imported European marble began to crack and mahogany fireplaces stopped being lit due to simple economizing on heating, he suddenly realized the full depth of the fall. This was a bitter, painful rethinking of the essence of wealth. He understood that money without a higher purpose does not preserve the family, but only accelerates its destruction. The power they so desperately demonstrated through the gigantic spaces of their homes turned out to be absolute fiction. At this critical moment, the heir's wife, the very woman who once became the catalyst for abandoning charity, appears in a completely new light. Her pragmatism, which previously seemed cynical selfishness, now becomes the only tool of survival. She understands that clinging to dead walls is pointless. The mansion, this symbol of their superiority, must be abandoned. Her decision to leave the house that was once the center of their universe looks not like defeat, but as a harsh necessity of surgical intervention to save what little remained of real assets. The transition from ownership to preserving the remnants of the fortune became the main leitmotif of this period.
the family makes a heavy decision. They retreat. Huge estates requiring insane costs are put up for sale for a song, or simply locked with heavy locks. Nature slowly begins to reclaim its own. Overgrown driveways hide wrought iron gates, and dust lays a thick layer on antique furniture smelling of centuries. The house, built for centuries, did not last in its pristine splendor even 100 years. But in this defeat lies a deep, transcendent meaning.
Losing their physical castle, the heirs were forced to reconsider the very concept of legacy. If before they sought recognition through architectural dominance, now they realized that the only thing that truly remained from their dynasty was the name embossed on a cheap lead tube. Their personal ambition, unsupported by moral duty, led to isolation and oblivion. What will remain after the last ceilings of the $7.5 million mansion collapse? And what cruel but necessary lesson does this story teach each of us today? Today, standing before the slowly crumbling facade of the monumental mansion, whose market value is forever frozen at $7.5 million, we see not just abandoned elite real estate. We become direct witnesses to the final act of one of the most astonishing and instructive dramas in the history of American capitalism. The cold wind freely roams through the 40 empty grand rooms, methodically stripping away the remnants of gilded stucco. In the gigantic hall, where the country's political elite was once received, only dry branches now fall through broken windows onto the imported marble. Nature mercilessly erases traces of human vanity. This colossal architectural project, conceived by the heirs as an indestructible monument to their power, before our eyes has turned into a mausoleum of lost meanings. The tragedy of the Colgate family is a classic, almost ancient story of how incredibly fragile human nature is in the face of unlimited wealth. William Colgate, who emerged from the damp New York soapworks, turned out to be a surprisingly prescient thinker. He intuitively, on a deep animal level, understood that without strict artificial restraints, huge money inevitably corrupts the soul. His sacred vow to give part of the profits to charity was not just an act of public mercy. This was a complex psychological mechanism, a desperate attempt to instill in his descendants spiritual immunity against all-consuming pride. But this strategist made one fatal mistake. He believed that inner discipline could be passed down by inheritance as easily as bank accounts. The denouement of this historical drama forever transforms facts into a universal, piercing lesson. When later generations finally severed the connection with the ancestor, when they coldly replaced service to society with blind consumption, they deprived themselves of the fundamental meaning of existence. Their story is frighteningly and in detail similar to the tragic fate of another legendary family, the Vanderbilts. They too built colossal palaces along the entire east coast of the United States of America, trying to physically stake their high place in eternity. And today the huge Vanderbilt palaces either stand as empty museums or were long ago demolished to the ground. Both of these dynasties prove the immutable law. Pure capital accumulation, devoid of a higher purpose, inevitably leads to collapse in the third generation. How does this story resonate in us today? We live in an era of insane, unending race for material success, where the scale of human personality is too often measured by the area of country real estate and the number of zeros in the account. Millions of people wake up every day with the single thought of how to earn even more, how to build their absolutely impenetrable castle. But the cold ruins of the Colgate Empire pose to us an extremely painful philosophical question. What will actually remain after us? When inexorable time grinds our houses and cars into gray dust, what will have real value? Is it worth spending decades erecting thick stone walls if inside these walls there is absolutely no one and nothing to live for? And it is precisely here that the most powerful paradox lies, which completely overturns our initial understanding of this story.
All desperate attempts by arrogant heirs to immortalize their supposed greatness through expensive marble staircases and massive crystal chandeliers suffered absolute crushing failure. Today, no one remembers their loud names or admires their social receptions. The only thing that truly survived the harsh test of time is that very name of the simple soap boiler, reeking of caustic lie. The name of the modest man who wore his hands bloody at the red-hot cauldron, and who knew exactly. True legacy is measured not by how much you managed to accumulate and hide, but exclusively by how much you once dared to give to the world.